packed federal courtroom went suddenly quiet. Every eye fixed on the unexpected confrontation unfolding between two powerful figures. Judge William Alsup, renowned for his brilliant legal mind and no-nonsense demeanor, had just done something shocking during Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett's presentation of evidence. As Crockett methodically detailed how a chemical company had knowingly contaminated a minority community's water supply for decades, the distinguished 7-8-year-old judge's lips had curled into an unmistakable grin. The dismissive smile was subtle but clear to everyone watching. Crockett, the former civil rights attorney now serving in Congress, stopped mid-sentence. Standing at the podium in her striking navy blue suit with gold accents, she fixed her gaze directly on the judge. "Your Honor," she said, her voice cutting through the silence with perfect clarity, "I need to ask, does the documented poisoning of American children strike you as amusing?" The atmosphere in the courtroom instantly transformed. Corporate lawyers exchanged nervous glances, journalists frantically scribbled notes. Community members who had suffered for years from rare cancers and birth defects leaned forward, hardly believing someone had finally confronted the system that had dismissed them for decades. Judge Alsup's grin vanished. For perhaps the first time in his distinguished career, the formidable jurist appeared momentarily speechless. What happened next would change the course of environmental justice in America and prove that sometimes speaking truth to power is the only way to ensure the law protects everyone equally, regardless of their zip code or income level. Before we continue with this extraordinary courtroom confrontation, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories of justice being served despite seemingly impossible odds. Judge William Alsup had earned his reputation through decades of handling complex cases in the Northern District of California. Appointed by President Clinton in 1999, the Mississippi-born judge had become known for his unusual combination of technical expertise and plain-spoken manner. With a degree in mathematics and experience as an engineer before entering law, Alsup had famously taught himself Java programming to better understand the Google v. Oracle case. His independence was legendary. He had ruled against both Republican and Democratic administrations when he believed they overstepped legal boundaries. Alsup had a particular reputation for being skeptical of what he called lawyer theatrics. He preferred hard evidence and clear legal reasoning over emotional appeals. His tough questioning had reduced many seasoned attorneys to stammering confusion, and his impatience with unprepared counsel was well documented in legal circles. At 78, with his wire-rimmed glasses and stern demeanor, he projected the image of someone who had seen every legal trick and was not easily impressed. Across the courtroom stood Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, who had taken an unusual step for a sitting member of Congress, requesting special permission to argue this specific case because of its profound importance to her former constituents. Before her election to Congress, Crockett had built a sterling reputation as a civil rights attorney who specialized in environmental justice cases. She had represented communities fighting against corporate polluters in her home state of Texas, winning several landmark settlements that forced companies to clean up toxic waste sites. The case before the court involved a chemical manufacturing plant that had allegedly dumped carcinogenic waste into groundwater for decades in a predominantly Black and Hispanic neighborhood. Despite hundreds of cases of rare cancers and birth defects in the community, the company had avoided responsibility through technical legal maneuvers. After multiple judges had dismissed the case on procedural grounds, the community had finally secured a hearing before Judge Alsup, whose expertise in both science and law made him uniquely qualified to understand the complex technical evidence. What made this hearing particularly significant was its timing. The Supreme Court had recently narrowed the EPA's authority to regulate certain types of pollution. This case represented one of the first major tests of whether communities could still seek justice through the courts when regulatory protections failed them. The precedent set here would potentially affect thousands of similar cases nationwide. The tension between Alsup and Crockett represented fundamentally different approaches to justice. Alsup embodied the traditional view that courts should be dispassionate forums where evidence and legal precedent, not emotion, determined outcomes. Crockett represented a newer perspective that recognized how seemingly neutral procedures had often been used to deny justice to marginalized communities. The visual contrast between them was striking. Alsup in his black robes on the elevated bench, projecting institutional authority. Crockett standing at the podium below, representing a community that had been fighting for basic dignity for decades. If you've ever witnessed a moment where someone stood up to authority for what's right, share your experience in the comments below. Has there been a time when you had to speak truth to power? Your story might inspire others facing similar challenges. Your Honor, the evidence clearly shows a pattern of deliberate contamination, Crockett began, methodically laying out how the chemical company had dumped trichloroethylene, TCE, into unlined pits for over 30 years, despite internal documents showing they knew about the health risks. She displayed a series of maps showing cancer clusters that closely corresponded with groundwater plumes flowing from the facility. The company's own monitoring wells showed TCE concentrations over 10,000 times the EPA's safety limit. She continued, her voice steady as she presented data from 3 separate environmental engineering firms. Meanwhile, her internal memos, which we obtained through Discovery Show executives, discussing how much cheaper it was to pay occasional fines than to dispose of these chemicals properly. Judge Alsup leaned forward, adjusting his glasses as he examined the documents. Congresswoman Crockett, he interrupted, every manufacturing facility deals with waste disposal challenges. Are you suggesting that any company that has ever exceeded permitted levels should face unlimited liability decades later? Crockett responded carefully, no, Your Honor. I'm suggesting that this specific company made calculated decisions to poison this specific community because they determined it was profitable to do so, and unlikely they would face consequences. There's a critical difference between occasional accidental overages and systematic, deliberate contamination. The tension in the courtroom noticeably increased. Several corporate attorneys whispered to each other, while community members in the gallery sat perfectly still, hanging on every word. Crockett continued by showing internal company emails where executives specifically discussed how the affected neighborhood lacked political power and would be unlikely to secure legal representation. She then presented health data showing cancer rates in the community were 6 times the national average, with particularly elevated rates of rare liver cancers strongly associated with TCE exposure. These aren't coincidences, she explained, displaying a timeline that matched company dumping activities with later disease clusters. These are cause and effect relationships that have destroyed hundreds of lives. Judge Alsup's expression hardened. The law doesn't operate on emotional appeals, counselor, he said, his tone growing dismissive. Courts require causation to be established with scientific certainty, not correlation and conjecture. With respect, Your Honor, Crockett countered, I've presented peer-reviewed epidemiological studies from 3 major research universities establishing causation to the standard required under Daubert. This isn't emotion, it's evidence. That's when it happened. As Crockett cited a precedent from a similar environmental justice case, Judge Alsup's lips curled into an unmistakable grin. He shook his head slightly, as if listening to an argument from a naive first-year law student. The expression lasted only seconds, but it sent a ripple through the courtroom. Several journalists looked up from their notepads. The community members in the gallery stiffened in their seats. Crockett stopped mid-sentence. The courtroom grew uncomfortably quiet. I'm curious, Your Honor, she said, her voice calm but resolute. Does the systematic poisoning of low-income communities strike you as humorous? The directness of the question stunned the courtroom. Federal judges were rarely challenged this way. Alsup's grin vanished instantly. I'm simply noting that the precedent you're citing was limited by subsequent rulings, he replied, his tone defensive. Then perhaps you could articulate that perspective rather than grinning at my argument, Crockett responded firmly, because the families who have buried their children deserve more than a smile. Before Alsup could respond, Crockett continued, and since you find my citation amusing, allow me to direct the court's attention to your own ruling in Sierra Club v. ChemCorp from 2017. The atmosphere in the courtroom transformed completely. Crockett's team quickly displayed on the screen a quote from one of Judge Alsup's previous opinions. The Congresswoman hadn't been provoked into an emotional outburst. She had been setting up a powerful legal argument. In Your Honor's opinion in Sierra Club, Crockett continued confidently, you wrote, and I quote, when corporations possess internal evidence of harm and deliberately continue practices they know endanger communities, Courts must apply heightened scrutiny to ensure that procedural technicalities do not obstruct substantive justice. The quote remained displayed as Crockett let Alsup's own words hang in the air. Several spectators glanced at the judge, whose expression had become completely serious. "That was your standard, Judge Alsup," she continued precisely. "And today, I've presented overwhelming evidence that this company not only knew about the harm they were causing, but actively concealed it while continuing to dump carcinogens into this community's groundwater." Alsup shifted his chair, visibly uncomfortable now. He began flipping through his notes, searching for a response. "The circumstances in Sierra Club were significantly different," he began, but Crockett was prepared. "Different circumstances, identical legal principle," she countered, pulling up a second quote. "In your 2019 address to the Environmental Law Conference, you stated that consistency in applying legal principles is the foundation of judicial legitimacy." I couldn't agree more. The courtroom was completely silent now. The corporate lawyers had stopped writing. Transfixed by this unexpected turn, community members in the gallery exchanged hopeful glances. "Let me be absolutely clear," Crockett continued, seizing the momentum. "I'm not asking for special treatment for these families. I'm asking for the exact legal standard that you yourself established in Sierra Club. If we apply your test consistently, as you've advocated, then this case must proceed to trial." She turned slightly to address the full courtroom. "The evidence before this court shows that over 300 families have suffered devastating health consequences, not because of bad luck or unknown causes, but because a corporation made a cold calculation that their lives were worth less than proper waste disposal." Crockett then delivered her most powerful argument. "Access to justice isn't a legal technicality, Your Honor. It's the cornerstone of our entire system." When Judge Alsup grins at arguments about environmental justice, he's not just dismissing my legal reasoning, he's dismissing the fundamental principle that corporations cannot poison Americans with impunity just because those Americans live in poor neighborhoods. She paused, making deliberate eye contact with the judge. "I'm not asking for sympathy, I'm asking for consistency. Apply the very standard Your Honor articulated in Sierra Club. Follow the evidence where it leads. And if you do, the conclusion is inescapable. This case deserves its day in court." The impact of her argument was immediately visible. Judge Alsup had stopped taking notes. He was now listening intently, his earlier dismissiveness completely gone. Several of the corporate attorneys were frantically writing notes to each other, sensing the case slipping away from them. Judge Alsup cleared his throat. "Thank you, Congresswoman Crockett. Does opposing counsel wish to respond?" The lead attorney for the chemical company rose quickly. "Your Honor, Miss Crockett's emotional appeals shouldn't distract from the fundamental legal issues. The statute of limitations has clearly, Counselor," Alsup interrupted, his tone noticeably changed. "I'm more interested in addressing the internal documents Miss Crockett presented. Your client's executives apparently knew about groundwater contamination as early as 1987, but continued the same disposal practices until 2008. How do you reconcile that with the good faith requirements under environmental regulations?" The corporate attorney appeared momentarily stunned by the question. "Well, Your Honor, those documents need to be understood in their proper context. Their context appears to be a systematic effort to conceal evidence of contamination." Alsup pressed. "Miss Crockett's team has presented internal memos discussing how to avoid regulatory scrutiny. I find that deeply troubling." The shift in Judge Alsup's approach was dramatic. The same judge who had grinned dismissively at Crockett's arguments earlier was now directing his legendary scrutiny toward the chemical company's defense. For the next 20 minutes, Alsup peppered the corporate attorneys with increasingly pointed questions about their clients' knowledge of the contamination, their efforts to monitor health effects in the community, and their decision to continue operations despite mounting evidence of harm. When the corporate legal team struggled to provide satisfactory answers, Alsup turned back to Crockett. "Congresswoman, you've raised serious questions about equitable tolling of the statute of limitations given the evidence of active concealment. I'd like additional briefing on that point specifically." Legal observers in the courtroom recognized the significance of this request immediately. Equitable tolling was a doctrine that prevented companies from benefiting from statutes of limitations when they had actively concealed evidence of harm. By focusing on this issue, Alsup was signaling he was seriously considering allowing the case to move forward. "Of course, Your Honor," Crockett responded, "we're prepared to submit that briefing by the end of the week. As the hearing concluded, something remarkable happened. Judge Alsup looked directly at the community members sitting in the gallery, the families who had lost loved ones to rare cancers, the parents of children born with devastating birth defects, the residents who could no longer use their well water. This court understands the gravity of the allegations presented today, he said, his voice carrying a weight it hadn't possessed earlier. While I make no prejudgment on the merits, I believe these families deserve a full and fair hearing of their claims. The motion to dismiss is denied. This case will proceed to discovery and trial. The gallery erupted in gasps and muffled cries. Many of the community members clasped hands or wiped away tears. They had been fighting for this opportunity for over a decade. And for the first time, the justice system had not immediately shut its doors to them. As Crockett gathered her documents, 3 of the community leaders approached to thank her. This wasn't just a legal victory, it was a restoration of faith that the system could work for them too. The judge who had grinned dismissively at their suffering just an hour earlier had been transformed by the power of evidence, legal reasoning, and a fearless advocate who refused to be intimidated. By that evening, clips of the exchange between Crockett and Alsup had spread widely across social media and legal circles. The moment when Crockett directly challenged the judge's grin, "Does the systematic poisoning of low-income communities strike you as humorous?" had been viewed over 2 million times within hours. Legal commentators and environmental justice advocates began analyzing every aspect of the confrontation. "What we witnessed today was extraordinary," said a prominent legal analyst on a cable news program. Congresswoman Crockett didn't just win a legal argument, she changed the entire framing of environmental justice cases. By citing Judge Alsup's own precedent back to him, she created a standard that will be difficult for other courts to ignore. Conservative legal commentators took a different view. This kind of direct challenge to a federal judge undermines judicial independence, argued a former Justice Department official. There are appropriate ways to make legal arguments without creating confrontational moments. But even critics acknowledged Crockett's effectiveness, regardless of whether her approach was orthodox, admitted a corporate defense attorney on a legal podcast. Congresswoman Crockett clearly came prepared with an intimate knowledge of Judge Alsup's record and used it masterfully when the opportunity presented itself. The impact of the hearing extended far beyond media discussion. By the next morning, 3 other federal judges had denied similar motions to dismiss in environmental justice cases, explicitly citing Alsup's decision. Legal experts noted that Crockett had effectively created a domino effect that could benefit communities nationwide. Before yesterday, companies had a reliable playbook for avoiding accountability in these cases, explained an environmental law professor. They would delay, conceal evidence until statutes of limitations expired, then claim immunity. Crockett and Alsup just rewrote that playbook. The case had equally significant political repercussions. Environmental justice legislation that had been stalled in congressional committees suddenly gained new momentum. Representatives from both parties began signaling support, particularly those from districts with similar contamination issues. When people see justice being pursued so effectively, it changes the political calculation, observed a veteran political strategist. Suddenly, standing with polluters becomes much more politically dangerous. For the affected community, the impact was profoundly personal. Town hall meetings overflowed as residents shared stories of loved ones lost to cancer and expressed hope that accountability might finally be possible. Local health officials began setting up additional screening programs, and environmental engineers started planning remediation options for the contaminated groundwater. For the first time in 30 years, people in our neighborhood feel seen, said Maria Gonzalez, a community organizer who had lost both parents to rare liver cancers. "We've been telling our stories for decades, but until yesterday, the system treated us as disposable." The chemical company's stock price plummeted as investors recognized the potential liability they faced. Securities analysts downgraded their outlook, noting that similar cases might emerge in other communities where the company operated. Within days, shareholder lawsuits were filed, alleging executives had concealed environmental liabilities from investors. Inside the company, the fallout was immediate. Board members called an emergency meeting where the CEO and general counsel were forced to explain how internal documents showing deliberate pollution had been allowed to exist, let alone become public. Anonymous sources reported that several executives were asked to resign, while others scrambled to implement new environmental compliance measures. Industry publications warned other companies to review their own environmental practices. The Alsup ruling, as it quickly became known, was described as a potential watershed moment for corporate accountability. Legal seminars were hastily organized to advise companies on managing their environmental liability in this new landscape. Meanwhile, environmental justice advocates who had been fighting similar battles across the country seized on the momentum. Community groups in Cancer Alley, along the Mississippi River in Louisiana, the heavily polluted neighborhoods of East Chicago, and indigenous communities near uranium mines all filed new legal challenges citing the Alsup precedent. What Congresswoman Crockett accomplished goes beyond a single case, explained a veteran environmental attorney. She demonstrated that the law can work for environmental justice communities if advocates are willing to hold both corporations and the courts themselves to their own standards. 3 weeks after the hearing, in a move that stunned legal observers, the chemical company approached Crockett's team with a settlement offer. Rather than face years of discovery that would expose decades of corporate malfeasance, they proposed a $780 million fund for healthcare, property remediation, and direct compensation to affected families. The offer came with unusual transparency requirements. Unlike typical corporate settlements that included confidentiality provisions, this agreement would require the company to publicly disclose all internal documents related to the contamination, create an independent monitoring system to prevent future violations, and fund research into the health effects of TCE exposure. Community members met for 3 days to discuss whether to accept the settlement. Some wanted to proceed to trial, hoping for larger damages and more severe consequences for the company. Others feared the company might declare bankruptcy to avoid liability if the case dragged on. In the end, they voted overwhelmingly to accept the settlement with one crucial modification. They insisted on a formal public acknowledgement of wrongdoing by the company, something corporations almost never agree to in environmental cases. Remarkably, facing overwhelming evidence and public pressure, the company agreed. Judge Alsup, in an unusual move, requested a public hearing to review the settlement terms. When the courtroom filled for this final proceeding, observers noted a marked difference in his demeanor. The dismissive attitude from the earlier hearing was completely gone, replaced by a solemn attentiveness as community members testified about their experiences. After listening to hours of testimony from affected residents, Alsup addressed the court. This settlement represents an important step toward justice, he stated, but its true significance lies beyond the monetary compensation. It acknowledges that no community should bear disproportionate environmental burdens simply because they lack political influence or economic power. He turned his attention to the company executives seated in the courtroom. It also serves as a reminder that corporations cannot treat compliance with environmental laws as merely a cost-benefit analysis. Human lives are not entries on a balance sheet. He then did something federal judges rarely do. He addressed his own behavior directly. This court wishes to acknowledge Congresswoman Crockett's exceptional advocacy, he said. Her willingness to hold not just the defendants, but this court itself to the highest standards of legal consistency reflects the finest traditions of the bar. She reminded us all that justice must not only be done, but must be seen to be done without prejudice or dismissiveness toward any community. Alsup looked directly at the residents in the gallery. More importantly, I want to thank the community members who have fought for decades to be heard. Your persistence in the face of institutional indifference is the true foundation of today's outcome. Legal scholars would later describe this statement as remarkable for its humility and self-reflection from a judge of Alsup's stature. The settlement's implementation began immediately. Within months, advanced water filtration systems were installed in every affected home. A state-of-the-art medical facility specializing in environmental illnesses opened in the community. Property values, which had collapsed due to the contamination, began to recover as remediation efforts showed progress. For Crockett herself, the case represented something beyond a legal victory. When interviewed on a national news program, she explained, "This wasn't about embarrassing Judge Alsup. It was about ensuring that fundamental principles of environmental justice aren't just theoretical, they're actually applied in real courtrooms for real people." She continued, "Sometimes securing justice requires being willing to speak uncomfortable truths even to those in positions of power. When a judge grins at arguments about people dying from corporate pollution, that deserves to be challenged, not out of disrespect for the court, but out of profound respect for the law's promise of equal justice. The case became a central component of legal education. Harvard Law School developed an entire seminar around the case, examining how Crockett had effectively used a judge's own words to reshape environmental justice jurisprudence. The course, titled Speaking Truth to Power: Advocacy in Environmental Justice, became one of the most sought-after electives at law schools nationwide. What makes the Alsup-Crockett exchange so pedagogically valuable, explained a professor of trial advocacy, is that it demonstrates how to respond to institutional dismissiveness without sacrificing legal substance. Congresswoman Crockett didn't just call out the judge's grin, she immediately pivoted to substantive legal arguments using the judge's own precedents. The case's legacy continued to grow in the months and years that followed. Law schools began teaching the Crockett-Alsup exchange in courses on environmental law and advocacy. The Alsup standard, as it became known, was cited in dozens of subsequent cases involving corporate pollution in disadvantaged communities. Environmental regulators also responded to the case. The EPA issued new guidelines for evaluating cumulative impacts in environmental justice communities and strengthened enforcement in areas with historical patterns of contamination. State environmental agencies developed enhanced monitoring programs for groundwater near industrial facilities. Perhaps most significantly, Judge William Alsup himself underwent a transformation. In the years before his retirement, he became known as one of the judiciary's strongest voices for environmental justice. He wrote several influential opinions that expanded access to courts for communities facing environmental harm and spoke frequently about the importance of judges examining their own biases. He established a mentor program pairing federal judges with environmental justice advocates to help the judiciary better understand the realities facing contaminated communities. The program, initially controversial within judicial circles, eventually expanded to courts across the country. When asked at a judicial conference about his remarkable shift, Alsup responded with characteristic directness. Sometimes, it takes someone brave enough to call out a momentary lapse to help you recognize a systematic blind spot. Congresswoman Crockett did that for me, and the law is better for it. He added, "Judges aren't immune from unconscious biases. We may think certain communities or certain types of cases deserve less serious consideration. Being forced to confront that tendency, even when it's uncomfortable, is essential to ensuring equal justice." The chemical company, facing similar litigation in other communities, ultimately transformed its business practices. Under new leadership, it invested heavily in non-toxic alternatives and remediation technologies. In a surprising turn, the company eventually became an advocate for stronger environmental regulations, arguing that consistent standards were actually better for business than the previous patchwork approach. 5 years after the hearing, when Crockett visited a community center built with settlement funds in the formerly contaminated neighborhood, an elderly resident approached her. "I watched my grandson graduate high school last week," the woman said, tears in her eyes. "The doctors said he wouldn't live past 10 because of his birth defects from the water. But the medical treatment from the settlement saved his life. You didn't just win a case that day, you saved our future." For Crockett, that moment encapsulated why confronting power, even at personal and professional risk, was always worth it. The case hadn't just changed legal precedent, it had transformed lives. A decade later, the community had been revitalized. Where abandoned homes and shuttered businesses once stood, there were now parks, community gardens, and thriving local enterprises. The medical center had become a national research hub for environmental health, developing treatments that benefited communities across the country facing similar contamination. Most importantly, cancer rates in the community had returned to national averages. Children no longer grew up with the expectation of illness. Residents no longer feared their water or worried about the soil in their gardens, and it all began with a dismissive grin that inspired a fierce reply. If you found this analysis of a pivotal moment in environmental justice valuable, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel. We'll continue bringing you these in-depth stories of courageous advocates who refuse to be silenced when fighting for what's right. Share your thoughts in the comments below. What other environmental justice cases deserve more attention? The conversation continues, and we want to hear your voice.